First off, questions about last time? Any questions left over from differentiation? Okay, so we're going to move on.
Actually.
Yeah.
Would the opposite of differentiation be enmeshment, or is that not like exactly?
Perfect question. Right. That's what confuses everybody. No, the opposite of differentiation. There is no opposite of differentiation because differentiation is not one side or another side. Differentiation is something that goes from low to high. So there's lower and higher differentiation. And I think that was a good thing, that the way Bowen put it in, because it's not something that's either there or not. In other words, now why is it not enmeshment? See, differentiation does not mean separation. That's the most common confusion. That when you say
it's a negative connotation.
What's that?
For some reason, I feel like it has a bit of a negative connotation.
Differentiation.
If it's like, like.
Yeah. Well, if you think that it means separation, if you think that it means, what Bowen refers to as cutoff, which is not what it means, then you would say, well, what's this differentiation? Why don't we just be all happy together? But that's not what Bowen means. What Bowen means by differentiation is that there are two ways. The question that we're dealing with is what's the difference between differentiation and cutoff, or is enmeshment the opposite? I'll start over because it's a question I think that many of you may have had. Is enmeshment the opposite of differentiation? Differentiation is a form of relatedness. It's not a lack of relatedness. It's a form of relatedness. It's a form of relatedness that allows for interpersonal creativity. In other words, it allows for co-creation. It allows for the meetings that are creative between people in a system. So it's not the separation of those people, one from each other. It's the ability to do things in a system that includes co-creation in dyads, right? Now, if you recall, there are two ways in which lower differentiation is expressed. One way of expressing lower differentiation is to just swallow each other up. That's enmeshment. Enmeshment is one form of lower differentiation. The other form of lower differentiation is what's called cutoff, which is that people have nothing to do with each other. They don't talk. And so if that's the over separation. And there's no room for, now, the reason it's confusing is that the most popular theory, which we'll spend two sessions on not long from now, is Minuchin's theory. And Minuchin has the, I believe, incorrect theory. It's a partial truth, but it's incorrect, that there are two poles to the boundaries between people. Because Minuchin doesn't see the creation between people as central. He sees the boundaries between people as central. And then there are two forms of boundaries. They're too rigid or they're too flexible. They're too fluid. Where they're too fluid, you have enmeshment. And where they're too rigid, you have what he refers to as a disengagement. So Minuchin has poles, right? So if you say, what's the opposite of disengagement? Enmeshment. What's the opposite of enmeshment? Disengagement. However, as we'll see, many families have moments of disengagement and also moments of enmeshment all at the same time. So then it looks like the idea of dividing things into those poles is not reality. There's something that's the matter with that way of thinking. And when we get to it, you'll see it's imported from biology. It doesn't work in creative systems. It works in biological systems. So Bowen's way of looking at it is those two poles are just two different ways of having low differentiation. And since there are two different ways of having low differentiation, it's not so surprising that they can coexist. In other words, that a certain family will at one moment seem to be more disengaged or cut off, and at another moment seem to be, he doesn't use the term enmesh, he refers to undifferentiated ego mass. In other words, that everybody's all the same. So, but you see, I'm glad that you asked the question, because it's the most common misunderstanding of differentiation, because the only person who uses the word differentiation in the way that he uses it is Bowen. No one else uses the word. And a sort of inexact way of using differentiation, you would assume that it's a matter of being separate. It's not a matter of being separate, because the co-creation that happens in dyads is anything but separate, right? But it's not enmeshed because there's room for two different people to co-create, right? If it's enmeshed, we all think the same, so we don't have to create anything. There's no difference. Or we don't have any contact with each other, and then you can't co-create. So co-creation, which is what we're going to talk about today, is central for differentiation. Now, did Bowen say that? No. So the fact that you had a question, I think that Bowen and the people who he trained were also confused by that. And you'll see that, if you recall when I talked to you about Bowen's experience with his father, that new understanding of what a relationship is, right? That he didn't clarify, he didn't conceptualize it. So Bowen's actual theory includes eye positions and not being triangles, and we're adding in co-creation because I think it's central, but in 1970 among males it couldn't be conceptualized in America, and for some reason in 1990 with his student it still didn't get conceptualized. But if you add it in, I think differentiation becomes clearer. See, once you know that differentiation, the goal of differentiation is co-creation, so you wouldn't say that the opposite is enmeshment or cutoff. Those are the lower differentiation which don't allow for co-creation, and that's the tragedy of lower differentiation. It's not a bad thing. And what do people do when they're involved with lower differentiation? More regulation and less intersubjective. That's why we saw in the last slide that as you go from, in that complementary series, you go up towards more intersubjectivity, that corresponds to a rise in differentiation. That's not in Bowen's theory. There are two things that are missing there. The two things that are missing are, when you have lower differentiation, what are you doing? Aside from low differentiation, it sounds like that's just like missing something. What are you doing? Regulation. And when you're doing high differentiation, what are you doing there? And the answer is co-creation, intersubjective. That allows you to understand the activities that are going on in the family with lower differentiation and higher differentiation. So it's good that you asked, because does that make it clearer? It'll get clearer as we go up. It'll get clearer as we go along. There. Hold on. That's good enough. It just needs to. Okay, the house is falling down. Is that clearer now? Now, when we talk about the central aspect of co-creation, that's where we need to work a little bit harder to understand what on earth we're talking about. Because the notion of co-creation is something that it has to speak to us. We have to have a sense of when that happens, what happens, and why it's an important thing. Because you'll see as you work in family therapy, that your goal, if you're seeing an individual and talking about their family, or a couple in the room, or more than, your goal is to allow the family to give itself moments of co-creation, right? That's when differentiation rises. So, Debbie, did you have a question?
I don't know what it was.
Okay, it'll come back. We're dealing in an area where people generally don't deal. In other words, right now, what we're going to talk about today is something that's missing from family therapy. It's missing in Western philosophy. It's something that's very important to human experience, which doesn't have a place in the West. So we're going to end up looking for terms, as the person who created it was looking for terms. But first of all, let's start with what's more familiar. Anybody know what organ this is? This is not a biology class, but some of you may recognize. It's supposed to be your best friend, at least parts of it. Now, it was well known. Well known means a well-known mistake. You know, anytime that all scientists agree, you should say to yourself, what are they missing? Right? Because science doesn't really work that way. So neurologists all understood that the front part, you're looking at the brain from the side, this is the front. Your eyes are somewhere around here if you want to look at it. The front part is where you do things, and the back part is where you feel things, right? That's called the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Front and back of the bus. The front of the bus is a map here of the body. And when you stimulate different parts of this part in the front, muscles move. Depending where the map is, the muscle, the hand will move, the foot will move. There's a map of moving the body in the front. And in the back, there's a corresponding map of the body. And if you stimulate them, you'll feel things in your skin, right? In your limbs, hands, trunk, whatever. So there's a map of the body. This is the sensation, and this is the doing and feeling. Agreed to by all neurologists up until 1996 or 7. So we're dealing with something that's the last 20 years in brain science, which you'll see the importance of. Now the question is, what goes on here, right in the middle? And it turns out that right here, right in the middle, it's in the front, it's in the back of the front, but it's still in the front. There are these neurons that behave in a strange way. How do they act in a strange way? Well, you take these monkeys and put them in a laboratory, see? And this happened by mistake in a laboratory in Italy. If it had happened in New York, they would have killed the laboratory assistant. But it was a surprise that happened in Italy, where they're eating pasta, drinking wine. You know, it's a little bit more happy in the laboratory of Risoletto in Parma in 1996-97. You take a monkey, and they were interested to see not just, you know, this muscle or that muscle. They wanted to see what happens in the front of the brain when you do a meaningful activity. Now, for monkeys, the most meaningful activity is reaching for a banana. So there were some bananas out there, and there's a monkey, and you take this, you know, very thin wire, and you stick it into certain places in the front of the brain, where it's supposed to be doing things, and the monkey reaches for the banana, and the lead in a certain part of the brain goes, you know, it has a sensor, goes, So you say, oppa, that's great. Now we see that when you're doing a meaningful activity, complex activity, like reaching for a banana, that's where the brain goes, in other words, it's stimulated. There's activity in the brain. Okay, time for a break, everybody's happy. So the monkey is just doing nothing, as monkeys sometimes do, and the research assistant was a little hungry, and he reached for an apple. The research assistant, his hand went and reached for an apple. The monkey was doing nothing, but the monkey's brain went, So as I say, if this had been in Los Angeles, they would have fired the research assistant. Where the hell did you put the cable? What's the matter with you? And if it had been in New York, they would have killed him on the spot. But this was Italy, so they said, "Wow, look at that! This is a funny monkey, right?" So they said, "Let's play with this a little bit. Show the monkey these different movements," and the monkey's brain kept going off as if it was doing the movement. But in the part of the brain that's doing a movement, not the part of the brain that is receiving and understanding and looking. And it's not a complex reception, it's an immediate perception. I feel that I'm doing what you're doing. So this became what can be called a mirror neuron. You can see why it's called a mirror, right? In other words, you're raising your hand, and my brain says I'm raising my hand. Now that isn't supposed to happen. You have to have a lot of pasta and a lot of wine to accept the fact that that could actually happen. But that's what started to happen. And it turns out that in humans, there are regions in our brain that are supposed to be doing things, so actually receive what other people are doing and feel that we're doing them, right? Which, you think about it, can be the basis of imitation. How do you imitate somebody? Because you actually feel you're doing it. Or for those mothers who have kids in their first year, or fathers who have patience for kids in their first year, if you stick out your tongue at a baby, and the baby is in a good spirit and wants to cooperate, the baby will stick out their tongue. 6 months, 5 months. Now everybody knows that the baby cannot understand that that pink thing out of your mouth is the same as the pink thing in his mouth. And there's no way for the monkey to put all that together immediately. And if you time it, you see that it happens immediately. There's no time. You can time how long it takes for neurons to go from one to the other. If you take vision, you have to go to the back of the brain, the occipital thing, and then you have to go to the parietal, then you have to integrate it, and then you have to go to the front. There's no time for that. The baby's tongue comes out immediately. So Piaget, who was no small player in child development, said, beats me. It just doesn't fit with everything we know about child development. I can't explain how the baby can stick out their tongue. Well, it turns out that when you stick out your tongue, the baby's mirror neurons of their tongue go off as if that's my tongue going off. And then, since I feel that it's my tongue, so I stick my tongue out. Right? It's an immediate response. And it turns out that if you take people who are professional dancers in capoeira, and you sit them watching a performance of capoeira, and you look at what's going on in their bodies, it turns out that their brain is both seeing the dance and their brain is dancing. And if you show them classical ballet, it doesn't happen. And the same happens if you show classical ballet dancers a ballet. Their brain is dancing. The front part of the brain, the front part where it's supposed to be movement, is dancing. If you show them capoeira, it's quiet. They're just looking at something. Yeah.
That means that you need to be relating to it in order to feel it?
That it means something that's hard to put into words because Western language separates people, right? And so if you try to say, well, whose tongue is coming out here? So I'm seeing your tongue, but that's not exactly the case, because seeing your tongue is something that goes on the back of my brain, and I see it, and then I think about it, and I know it's your tongue, and then I can think about my tongue. That's not what's happening. It's like we have one tongue. Now that's not supposed to be the case. And now you could ask, enmeshment, right? Is that the source of what's confusing between people? Like that we're more connected hardwire than we would like to think. See, we'd like to think that the baby loves his mother, but it turns out that half of the movements the mother's making, the baby thinks are his movements. He experiences them as his movements.
Why only half?
I just made that up.
Oh, well, I'm saying for us, like, does our brain recognize every time you do any movement?
Right. So the question is, what about the adults? And the answer is that we have to separate things out, but not completely. You see, we're not monkeys. That's probably true for most of us most of the time. But so we separate things out. But if you look at guys watching soccer, I don't know if you've had the experience of watching guys watching soccer or watching soccer. When the goal goes in, the guys are excited because if you look at their brain, it's their foot that kicked that goal. They're watching the goal, and it feels like that was my foot to kick the goal. And that's why they're so excited. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe I didn't understand the answer. What I'm saying is,
Just talk a little louder.
the reason that the dancers, the ballet dancers, right? They were reacting to ballet, not to something else, is because
it's familiar.
Right.
It's familiar and meaningful.
So first there needs to be, before there is that kind of movement in the brain, there needs to be some kind of like...
Correct. It has to be a meaningful activity. That's part of the answer of why it's not all. In other words, if I just do this, no one's going to feel like they're, doing a weird activity because you're not familiar with it. It has no meaning. But if I say, wow, especially if I'm an inspirational political speaker, and I start to do these movements, if you like to watch the President of the United States, he's a master at it. Everybody's brain is doing these movements. It's doing this movement, and it's doing that. It's drama, but it's a drama that's familiar. And when you make a face of disdain, go like this, so everybody feels like that's what they're doing, right? Because it's familiar. Actually, if you think about it, it's a good way to understand shame. Shame is something that happens face to face. And if you think about it, when somebody is making a disparaging face at you, a scorning face at you, well, the face is muscles, right? And so my face is scorning myself. It feels to me like I'm making that face at myself, and that's the basis of shame. That's speculation. We're not there yet, but you see how this works? So we're much more closely wired to each other, and this is not some sort of pie in the sky. This is as close to pure brain science as we have. And it basically was the most important discovery of the last 20 years. The brain is now being looked at in a different way, so we're going to find some more. But you can imagine that when you're sitting with a client and the client's face is sad and your face becomes sad, so something's going to go about. You see, and sometimes what you do with a client is when they're sitting in a certain way, either naturally or artificially, you start to sit that way. Because if you start to sit that way, you start to feel what it feels like. But they feel that something's going on between, right? And it's immediate. It's not something that's we think about. There's something that happens immediately when we see activities going on in other people.
Can I just ask a question on that?
Yeah.
So when you say it's the basis of empathy, when we do the same thing, the client's feeling sad, we make that sad face, the sad movement. Does it sounds like the client should therefore feel even sadder.
Right. Well, the client, the question is, and these are questions that are speculative because we're talking about the laboratory and now we're thinking about the room. Thinking about the room in a conversation is different than knowing about the room. No one's done that. But the question is, if you have a sad face mirroring your patient's sad face, so isn't that going to make them sadder? And the answer is, being sad is partly sad and partly alone. It's going to make them a lot less alone, right? And so, but that's all speculation, which I favor. It's a good thing to speculate. Sooner or later, we'll test these things and we'll find out. But when you think about the mirror neurons, it's good to know that you have mirror neurons, and it's good to think about them, even if you don't know all the answers from the laboratory. See, so this would be this is the front of the brain, right? So here what happens is when you dance, this part goes off, and when you watch dancing that's familiar, so the back of the brain is supposed to be, going off, but so is the front of the brain. Right? So the fact that the front of the brain is also going on, and not just the back, means that you're mirroring. In other words, you feel like you're doing those activities. And that's immediate. There's no rewire. You see, the nervous system is busy doing things. If you think about it, once about 25 years, I was in some sort of a meeting with people who, this was before CBT, but the behaviorists were there, and I made some sort of a comment in a group about something being deep. And so everybody chuckled and said, what, that's a meaningless word, deep, right? But it turns out that if you look at the brain, that some things sort of are superficial in the sense that they go around once, and some things are deep in the sense that they go around and around and around and do something different. Because it's what's called re-entry. Parts of the brain connect to each other. And when we say that something's deep, these days, I think what we mean is that it involves a great deal of re-entry and complex re-entry, rather than something that just goes by. So we're able to now recover the word deep, which is a human experience. Why people wanted to wipe it out, I don't know. But the brain is doing things that are surprising to us, and this is one of them. Efraim?
Would that be like the experience of hearing a profound thought and just if you stop and think about it, so you're processing in different parts of the brain?
The question is, if you hear a profound thought and you start to sort of think about it in different ways, well, the word profound is the same as the word deep, right? And a deep thought, or a kasha, things that don't go easily, most of Tehillim, all of Mishle, and those words in Eov that you can understand, they go around, right? They make you do things, right? And it's not a bad thing. So that's what we're there for, So sometimes there'll be moments of silence in a room, and what will be going on is that the client is processing something, and that's a good thing. And usually you can see when somebody's processing something that their eyes stay fixed, and if you stay silent and say, okay, something's going on, when their eyes start to move, that's when you ask them what they're thinking about, because they've just completed a thought. So it's important to watch these sorts of things. Aside from thinking, it's also important to see what looks like re-entry and what looks like noise. So these sorts of things, you say, oh, mirror neurons, well, it's like there. It's always there, right? Everybody knows that a smile elicits a smile. But guess what? It's not that I see a smile back of my brain, think about the smile, understand the feeling of the smile, and then I decide to smile. There's no time for that. The smile comes right away as a mirror neuron. In other words, that's sort of like my smile, or your smile, or our smile. Now, how can you talk about our smile, right? That's like an absurdity in a Western language. But it's not an absurdity in human experience, okay? And here's an example of two research assistants discussing mirror neurons and doing it at the same time. You'll see this all the time. If you have interactions, you know, that are fun, you'll see it all the time. Now, it's useful to know, when I'm telling you about this, that when we talk about consciousness, consciousness has a time marker. Consciousness is not immediate. You know, there was an old Greek idea, and the Greeks were part of the problem here, that there's nothing faster than thought. Drop that. There are a lot of things faster than thought. Thought actually is not necessarily so fast. For example, just to have a response, if your nervous system responds to something that goes by, it has to be at least 1/100th of a second. Less than 1/100th of a second, but it's gone. It's gone. You didn't see it. They have to have time. And to have a complex response that involves re-entry, you have to have about 1/4 of a second or 1/3 of a second. And people who make videos know that, because they try not to show things less than 1/3 of a second, right? And if something that flashes faster than a 1/3 of a second is going to be confusing. You need to have that 1/3 of a second to so to be able to not just get confused, but to be conscious of something. You actually have to have somewhere between 1 and 10 seconds, mostly 3 seconds. Oh, now what does that mean? Well, take a line of poetry. Take a line of poetry. Take a line of poetry. How long did that take? 3 or 4 seconds, right? In other words, a lot of our phrases, a lot of the punctuation of our experience, where you put things into a package, a lot of those things need about 3 or 4 seconds. And people who make videos and want to have you conscious of something before you want to the next, always leave a couple of seconds. It's never less than 2 or 3 seconds. I happen to have a son who makes music videos, so when I learned this, I looked at that, and he wasn't impressed, but I was. So I said, you know, that's a laboratory. This is art, right? So experience, and if you look at the way you talk to your clients, if you look at the way you talk to your clients, you often will be involving in phrases that run about a few seconds, right? In other words, that's just a way of understanding something about, and you see if your client is, and there's no commas and there's no periods, it's just running, you say to yourself, this is a way of not sharing consciousness. And a lot of times you say, well, if we slow that up, or you say, here's what I'm hearing. Here's what I'm hearing, right? So you package a moment of consciousness. And that's true of the mirror neurons as well. In other words, they work rather quickly, but to have consciousness, you need contact that's more than 1/3 of a second. You need to have a couple of seconds. Now, one way to think about this is this statue. It's a statue made by a Moroccan-French sculptor in Tzfat named Jonathan Darmon, who, when I saw it, I asked him for permission to photograph it. This is the statue. It's a male figure and a female figure. They seem to be quite connected to each other. Maybe they're doing mirror neurons. And this is the same statue. See, the statue dances. And that's why it was impressive to me. I said, do you mind if I take a picture of your statue in these two positions? He said, look, people come into my studio with a yarmulke. They all like this statue, and none of them buy it. And the reason they don't buy it is they say, it looks very nice, it speaks to me, but I wouldn't buy a statue that didn't have a source in Jewish text. You get me a source, you can take a picture. So the source is, hello? What's that? Say it again, I can't hear you. The what? Okay, that's not the one I use, but Basar Echad could be that, right? Any other sources? Anybody remember Baba Basra Tzadik Tet? It's got it, the what? The Kruvim, right. There's a question about the Kruvim. There's one pasuk says in Shemot that they're face to face, and the pasukim Divrei Hayamim has them looking at the wall, right? The Pneihem Labayit. And Shlomo HaMelech, who was smarter than everybody, he left it out, so it leaves your imagination, didn't get into it. But there's a, as it were, a contradiction between this and this, and there's a machloket of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, but we don't know who said what. One said, actually they were at an angle, you see, and so it depends how you look at it. You can, if you're at an angle, you could call it face to face. You call it, depends how you look at it. But the other one said they're sitting on axes, and they move. And what happens is that when things are going well between Knesset Yisrael and the Kadosh Baruch Hu, then they face each other. And when things go not so well, they don't. It's just
This is one
progress.
statue that just looks differently depending on, this
What?
is one statue depending on how you
Yes,
or it moves.
this is one statue.
But it moves, it's
It's
not
like
an optical illusion.
No, this is one statue. They actually are sitting on axes and they move. As a matter of fact, you see, it's the same statue. They just
I see.
they dance, right? They go face to face, and so Yonatan Darmon actually said, blind people like this statue because they can feel the movement, right? So those of you who are reading the Nefesh HaChaim know that he brings this source and then asks the systems question. I think the earlier systems question I understand, which he says, look, if the Kruvim are face to face, that's understandable. Things are going well. If Knesset Yisrael is moving, why is Kadosh Baruch Hu moving? It's enough that one of them would move. Why do they both move? That's a systems question. The answer is it's a system, right? That's the answer. So if those of you interested can find that. Anyway, this kind of a movement, you see, creates a situation which I'm trying to connect with mirror neurons and with co-creation, with people communicating face to face and creating in a way where the question of who's me and who's you is not the question. There's another question. And in order to understand that other question, you could see it this way, that there's me and there's you, and then we come face to face, and when we come face to face, both of us change. And so this movement, which I'm going to show you now, would be a way of looking at co-creation. Right? The two people come into direct contact, face to face. Something happens. It may not be explicit. It may not be an idea. It may be something that's communicated between them through the mirror neurons. And we come out different. It's a co-creation. Now, anybody have that experience in the world? This idea of the co-creation in 2019 is derivative from a few things, but mostly from the work of a Jewish writer named Martin Buber, whose name you may know. He's not popular among Haredim because he stopped being Shomer Mitzvot when he was 14. You should read his Bar Mitzvah address. It was pretty frum, but it only lasted a year. And what we're going to do now, since the idea that's connected to the mirror neuron and to the co-creation and is best expressed in Martin Buber, we're going to read some of it together. And you have it in your reader. I'm going to go out of this and go to the reader so we can see it. I'm just going to show it to you from the book. It's easier that way. How do I make this full screen? Anybody know how to make this full screen? Do it. Don't give me mirror neurons, There are no mirror bites. Just do it. How do you make this full screen? What?
There's a view option.
Oh, here we go.
Full screen down further. Keep going. There you go.
Full screen, there we go. Okay, thank you. Good. Okay. So those of you who want, you can see the book. The book there were two versions. It was translated in the 50s by a Scotsman. Those of you who are British will appreciate the Scottish translation. The Americans couldn't brook it, so the Americans had another translation into more American English by somebody who didn't like the book. This is a strange translation. So those of you who want to see it, this is the old one.
It's here, this is the thing in Java?
The one that you have is the PDF of the old translation. I believe there are, anybody want the German? There are, I believe, 5 translations into French. I think there are 4 into Russian, and there are actually 3 into Hebrew. The one that I think is most readable came out in 2019. But let's just walk ourselves through this book and try to understand what he's getting at, and the important part is not what he's getting at, but what we're getting out of it. In other words, what we can understand. So we have to skip here we go. Oh, I need my book back because I can't see this. Right. Okay. So now, let's have a look and see. This is a book of poetry. Nobody thinks this is a book of philosophy. It's not written like a book of philosophy. It's a book of poetry because what he's trying to express doesn't have simple language. Okay, so are you with me? You have it? You can follow it here. You can follow it in the reader. You know where we are? Yeah, okay. So let's go over a little bit and see if we can figure out what's important for family therapists here. To man, the world is twofold. In German, the world doesn't mean the physical world. It means the world of human experience. Welt does not mean all of physical. It doesn't include tables. It includes human experience. So the human world, to man, is twofold in accordance to his twofold attitude. Now, anybody experience the world as twofold? Probably not. Right? We try to sort of unify our experience, but what Buber is trying to say is that actually you can't unify your experience. There are 2 different forms of experience, and that depends on how you look at the world. The attitude of man is twofold. Attitude in this case means, in German it's Haltung, it's the way of approaching something. Thinking about it like those statues. Like, what's your position? It's like a dance. What's your eye position? The attitude of man is twofold, in accordance with the twofold nature of primary words which he speaks. Now, what are primary words? It's a way of thinking. Buber spent a year teaching these ideas in 1922, and we have the seminar that he gave where these ideas were developed. He didn't talk about primary words when he gave the seminar. He didn't know how to talk about it. When he finally started to write the book, people asked him for years, said, "This is a difficult book. I can't understand the first sentence. Why don't you write it regular?" Right? And some people have tried to rewrite it regular, and his answer was, "I didn't write it. I didn't write this, I was working on this and this came to me. It came to me this way and I recorded it." Poets are like that, right? They say, "Well, I didn't write it, so how can I change it?" So the idea of primary words being twofold is a way of expressing something that I think we saw in the statues. That's why I took the picture of the statues. The primary words are not words, really. They're not isolated words, they're combined words. Right? The one primary word is the combination I, thou. That's the way that you do it in Scotland. If it was in English, it would be I-you, and in the second translation it is I-you. And the other primary word is the combination I, it, wherein without a change in the primary word, one of the words he, she can replace it. In other words, it's third person. We can approach the world, we can approach the physical world, we can approach each other, we can approach the spiritual world from a position of third person or from a position of second person, right? So the 2 statues, when they're facing each other, that's second person. And pointing out all sorts of things, that's third person. The whole book is about the difference between second person and third person. But you see, the point is not to understand the grammar. The point is to understand that the grammar is actually saying something profound about our experiences. And our experiences, you see, the idea of experience in Western philosophy is that there's this object outside of us, and we know things about it, like it exists or it doesn't exist or whatever. And here, Buber would say, well, that's third person. All of Western philosophy is third person. Subject and the object is third person. You're thinking about it. But human beings also experience each other and the world second person. And when you do it in the second person, it's a different I. It's a whole different story. It's a different attitude towards the world. It's a different dance, saying I as opposed to saying it. Now, if you think about family relations, a lot of times there'll be discussions about somebody, and sometimes there'll be a direct communication with someone. Or if you think about the idea of co-creation, you can see that what we're looking for is moments of second-person communication, when you speak to you and not about it, right? So the idea of combined words...
Speaking to someone is a second...
Say that again?
Speaking to someone is secondary, it's not a primary.
No, speaking to someone is one primary word, and speaking about someone is the other primary word. The primary word I, you, is I'm talking to you. The primary word I, it is I'm talking about you, right? And so there are two different attitudes, right? Two different ways that you can approach the world. Does that make any sense to anyone? You have that? See, if you don't say, well, yeah, I've been there, and how come no one ever mentioned that before, right? Because it really is different. It really is quite different when you speak directly or you speak about something. But I thought it was the same I. No, says Buber, the I depends on what you're doing with the I. The I can be second person or third person, right? Hence, the I of the man is also twofold. Well, now there you take all of Western philosophy and go past it. The I is twofold. It depends what you're doing with the I. If you're speaking the I of I, thou, it's a different I. And if you're speaking about something, it's a different I. That's the idea, and if that's the case, then the I of the primary word I, thou is a different I from the primary word I, it. Okay, so we're together now? In other words, we do different things. When you see a couple in a room, some of the times they're belly aching about each other. And then you say, could you just talk to each other? And it's a different experience, right? And if they talk to each other through each other, it isn't yet a different experience. But when you say, well, how about if you try to talk to each other, then we're dealing with a different I. The I that can be creative, the I that can be involved in co-creation is the I thou, the I of the I thou, right? So now we're making a kind of a connection, which is that in family therapy, we're actually trying to help people to find moments of I thou. And that when differentiation is high, people take the risk of moments of I thou. And when the differentiation is low, people tend to be involved in I it, which would be regulation. Yeah.
So I just was thinking and wondering.
Thinking and wondering. So we're in the right area. Yeah.
What you just said, which is I thou is a much more highly differentiated stance than I it. I it, people can be talking to each other and still being in an I it relationship, and it's much less differentiated.
Right. So this is good. See, Debbie's saying out loud what Buber's going to say in another paragraph, right? That you can say you and mean it, and you can say it and mean you. Right? The question is whether you're engaged in the co-creation. You're engaged in a second-person process that's intersubjective. The word intersubjective comes from Buber. The word interpersonal comes from Buber. He created the term. So you see, we're dealing with a different way of looking at things, which is a challenge to the Western way of looking at things. So if we go on, primary words do not signify things. They intimate relations, right? A primary word, I, thou, and I, it doesn't happen out there. It's how I relate. I, thou is one way of relating. I, it is another way of relating. Primary words do not describe something that might exist independently of them, but being spoken, they bring about existence. What he means is that you make that move. It's like a dance. When you enter into the I, thou, you're not talking about something else. You're in it. And if you're doing an I, it, that's what you're doing. So you're not talking about something else. You're relating in one way or another. And depending on the way that you're relating, your I is different. Now, that is a challenge for therapists, isn't it? Right? Because we like to take a lot of information, and a lot of times when we take the information, we're doing a lot of I-it, right? The I-it isn't so much about the client, it's which I am I using? Am I allowing myself to bring myself to I-thou with a client, or am I just collecting information, in which case, not much is going to happen. If you think that co-creation is what happens between people, right? If you think that co-creation happens between people, then a lot of times when somebody is saying, well, my father got run over by a truck when I was 9, and then he was in bed for 6 months, and blah, 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 information, and you would say, I guess you probably remember that moment. Can you try to tell me about the moment when you heard that your father was hit by a truck? Now, is that information? Not only, you see, because we're asking to bring that moment between us, right? That's not now the I of I-it, it's a different I. You've all had that experience, right? But you see the way Boo-Boo would say it is, that's the moment when something's going to happen, right? It's not because of the content, it's because of the relating. But it's not a simple relating. And clients a lot of times will say, I don't really remember that very much, right? Because it's a painful moment. And you say, well, if you remember, who told you? Oh, we're trying to put another person into the room, right? Because that was an I-thou moment that was so painful that it's being, right? So it's, oh, my uncle came in. Can you see his face? Do you remember what he looked like? Did he look calm? Did he look distressed? Oh, he made me plutz. Okay, so now we're trying to recreate an I-thou moment, and in doing that, we're also making an I-thou moment between me and the client, because this is something he's never told anybody before, because it's painful and he's held it on, okay? So primary words are spoken from the being. In other words, this isn't something that you're thinking about. It's how you are. It's your being. Your being is directed second person or directed third person. It's not something that you do in your spare time. It's something you're doing now. There was a question? Yeah, okay. If the thou is said, the I of the combination I-thou is said along with it. You can follow that? In other words, we're not talking about words. We're talking about a relationship. So when I say you, that's the I of I-you. It's a different I. And if the it is said, the I of the combination I-it is said along with it. It's a different I. I'm turning second person, third person, second person, third person. Then we have an extraordinary poetic and very confusing sentence that the primary word I-thou can only be spoken with the whole being. The primary word I-it can never be spoken with the whole being. Now, where did the whole being jump into here, right? Where did the whole being jump into here? And what do you think? We could have finished before that. Why do we have the whole being here? What's whole about the being?
I-thou is a full experience.
The I is only full when it's speaking in the second person. Gewalt. What about the rest of the time, right? So that's one of the most problematic sentences in this. But if we say relative, it makes it easier, and that's, I think, what it means. In other words, when we say the I of I-thou, when we speak in second person to somebody, we become more whole. He says completely whole, but say it, more whole. In other words, I'm enlisting more parts, I'm doing more re-entry than I used to be doing. I'm becoming more whole in myself as I say second person. And when I'm staying in third person, I'm relaxing. I'm not fully there. Does that make sense to you? In other words, there's an experience that makes sense to you that when you talk in the second person, there's something more whole about what I'm bringing to it. You could say it makes me plutz, it makes me nervous, or you could say it makes me fulfilled, it makes me feel richer, it makes me feel that something is happening, right? And if he's talking about blah, 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 nothing's happening. That's what he means, yeah.
What's with enmeshment, which is an I and thou engagement?
Okay, so here now we start to deal with family therapy. So enmeshment is I-thou? No.
It's I.
Enmeshment is a way in which neither of us are whole people. In other words, we're not talking I, thou. We're talking, we're all the same. The I that's full is trying to speak to the second person, the thou that's full, is allowing a co-creation. Enmeshment is a way in which we don't do co-creation because we're all the same. So we never actually, it would be like, what Debbie said and that Buber wrote, it's talking to a you but meaning an it, meaning third person. We all, let's say I'm talking to my sister and I say, Dad, he doesn't listen, does he, Dad? Right? And she says, no, I never thought he listened either. She says, well, he didn't listen. So I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. We're agreeing that he didn't listen. So we're enmeshed. We're in a triangle. We're agreeing that Dad doesn't listen. We're not doing anything. Because I'm not saying to her, do you think I'm listening? Oh. Or she said to me, we talk about Dad all the time, but you're not talking to me. What's going on with you? Oh, that's a different one, right? So that's not enmeshed, because when people talk from I thou, they talk as two separate people who are meeting as separate people. It isn't the same as a merger, right? Enmeshment is more like a merger. We're all the same. The I thou is not a merger. It's the moment of a meeting, co-creation or intersubjective means there are two subjects and something going on between them. Enmeshment means we don't really care about the subjects, we're all just happy regulating. Does that make sense to you? It was a crucial question. Yeah, people have been fighting about this book for 100 years.
That example where I see the triangle and that it's complaining about Dad, but then there's also the experience of validation, which you could argue is a shared I thou.
Oh, well, because this is a poem, and reality is less poetic sometimes. And what Buber is after is a new thought. And so whenever you're after a new thought, you exaggerate it, right? So everybody knows what the ayid is. People have been doing 2,500 years of Western philosophy about ayid. That's not new. So it's the tendency is to exaggerate. So if you take Daniel's example, which is I'm talking to my sister about Dad, but while we're talking about Dad, we're also validating each other, right? Now, validating can be an I thou or an I it. Huh? I thou could mean you had the same experience as I did, so you and I share an experience. So then there's you and I that have shared an experience. That's I thou. If we just talk about him all the time, then we're not really validating, we're just invalidating him and using him in a triangle. So it was a subtle question.
But it's about Dad's.
What's that?
But it's about Dad's inability to keep,
let's talk a little louder.
We're agreeing, you and Danielle, whoever is talking about it, you're agreeing about something external.
Right. See, if we're talking about something external, we're not talking about between us. Right? We could be talking about our experiences with something external. My sister could say to me, I had this experience that I wasn't being listened to. Have you had that experience? And I said, I used that. So then we're talking to each other about experiences, right? But if we're talking about somebody else and why he's that way, then it's an it. Now, is that absolute? Listen, nobody does I thou. It's not a way to live. It's a book that challenges us to add some more richness, and hopefully some more richness to understanding family life or interpersonal life. But when you get to the details of when is it this and when it is that, you're asking him questions that are beyond the book. And Buber would say, see Buber, people said, are you a philosopher? And he said, who, me? Philosophers have organized systems of thinking, so you're trying to make this an organized system of thinking. So I don't have an organized system of thinking, but I'm like somebody who's, I'm talking to somebody and I see something out the window, so I point it out and say, there, that's what I saw. So that's what this book is. That's what I saw. It's not organized, it's not clean, it's provocative or evocative, but it's not an organized system. So there's lots of places where you can say, is it this or is it that? And the answer is, are you talking to me? Who cares if it's this or that? Tell me what your problem is and I'll, you know what I mean? In other words, that you can fall into the it, talking about I thou, right?
Yeah.
So you have to sort of try to take the book where it was going. So far, you're okay with me? So you see, what we're doing is we're finding a peculiar situation where you would say, why wasn't this the basis of family therapy? It sounds like it could have been. You know, that the whole idea of families is to find a way that in families you can say I thou more and be less stuck with I it, which is another way of saying you can do intersubjective more and be less stuck with regulation only. Or another way of saying you can raise your level of differentiation and co-create. So why wouldn't this, it was 1923 this book was written, why wasn't it the center of family therapy? And the answer is that it was. In other words, if you look, there was a series of articles that were written, family therapy was trying to define itself in the late 70s. So in those days, the most interesting journal in family therapy was Family Process. It's no longer the most interesting journal of anything. But for about 20 years, it was an astoundingly interesting, area of new ideas. So there's this number that was based on what on earth is family therapy? Or what is the epistemology? People like to use Greek words. What do we think we know in family therapy? In every article, the people writing said, well, the bottom line of it is the I Thou of Martin Buber. And how many of the articles did the book I Thou appear in the bibliography? 0. Nobody read the book. It's, as you see, it's a little challenging, and Americans don't like challenging books. So nobody read it, but everybody knew the term I Thou. Everybody knew that there's something about second-person communication that seems to be central to family therapy, but they missed Buber. There's a couple questions. Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought he was known as the contributing philosopher of existentialism, no?
Buber existentialism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that's my connection with that.
Was Buber an existentialist? Buber would say, if I wanted to be an existentialist, I'd have to be a philosopher. And I'm not. I'm just talking to you. That's what I'm doing. But in the 50s in America, the 3 major existential philosophers were Sartre, Heidegger, and Buber. Yeah. So he's included there. Is he an existentialist? Not exactly, because existentialists don't talk about relationships. For example, if you take Sartre, Sartre's famous statement is, the other person is my hell. That doesn't sound like this, does it, right? In other words, all of existential philosophy from Kierkegaard on, and certainly Nietzsche, is a struggle. Buber actually left that. Buber was, as a young man, was very, very highly influenced by Nietzsche. And you know about Nietzsche? Nietzsche was not a Nazi. He was a philosopher who the Nazis abused. But in America, that's not so well known. So Nietzsche was deeply involved with the idea of how a person becomes whole, how a person becomes real, how a person takes all of his gifts and realizes them. And that's what he called the man of the future, because he thought that German society or Western society was decadent in the sense that it held people back from realizing themselves. It was all about me, all about me. And so was Buber until he had this big turnaround. I and Thou was born out of a move from existentialism, which is about becoming whole or becoming one, to saying becoming two. In other words, relationships is primary. Human beings are primarily engaged in relationships and not just in building themselves. So as a result, it's a different kind of existentialist, or one would say, that's really, except for Buber, no one else is an existentialist like that. So, but you see, in America in the 50s, what they meant, when they said existentialist, what they mean is somebody who makes sense about something. In other words, somebody who is involved in something that isn't just silly, like the logical positivism that had taken over. So sort of everything got stuck. Anything that was like German or French or not silly was considered existential. But it's not very precise to call it that. But if you do it, nothing will happen. The skies haven't fallen yet. It's okay. Yeah, one more.
I know this term, I there, from Fritz Perls.
What's that?
I know this term, I there, from Fritz Perls.
From? Fritz Perls. Fritz Perls, yeah. Fritz Perls got it from Buber. But everybody got it from Buber. In other words, this book is considered a foundational book in Western thinking. Some people call it philosophy. Fritz Perls was involved in Gestalt. Now, Fritz Perls and the Gestalt movement was also engaged in something similar to Buber, and so they knew each other and they corresponded. And so the idea of a Gestalt, you could say, well, the Tao is a kind of a Gestalt. But Buber was going to a different place, which we'll see, because he was going into the area of co-creation. The only person who was leading towards co-creation was Buber. Everybody else took a little bit of turn from it, and Buber probably would have too, had he not had this Einfall and written this book, and then he was stuck with it, and so stuck with it in a positive way. In other words, this is foundational. This is different. This happened to me. And it was after an extraordinarily painful period. 1923, as you may recall, is after the First World War. And Buber had a huge crisis in the First World War. Like many other people, existentialists, Buber thought at the beginning of the war that this is terrific. You see, in the trenches people become whole, because they're not just doing business, they're doing life, right? And so Buber thought that the Germans and the French, it didn't matter which side you were on, but they were living life to its fullest and realizing themselves in the trenches. And his best friend was a Jew named Gustav Landauer. Gustav Landauer was one of these geniuses at the turn of the century who was a socialist. And Landauer wrote to Buber and said, really, out of your mind? The sons of the capitalists who are trying to get different markets are shooting and killing each other. And Buber is saying Hallel. Buber is saying Hallel. And he referred to Buber as a Kriegsbuber. The German word for a soldier is Kriegsmann. So he called Buber Kriegsbuber, you know, out of your mind. So they had this major disagreement, and Buber became somewhat disillusioned with the war, as most people did, as it turned into just a slaughterhouse. And at the end of the war, everybody expected it was going to be communism or socialism in the West. Nobody thought it was going to happen in Russia, but everybody thought it was going to happen in Germany. And it did indeed happen in Bavaria. And the Minister of Education of the new Bavarian Socialist Republic was Gustav Landauer, and he was assassinated, and the whole thing was put down. But Buber's best friend was assassinated. And this led to serious soul searching, and Ayanda was born out of that kind of soul searching. In other words, out of a sense of, if I just do me, I'm lost. Where does it go? What happens? So I get to be me. So everybody got to be me in the war, and then they killed each other. And what was happening in the world, right? So out of that, turning from that, Ayanda was born. So he was born out of a great deal of pain. And then Buber had a next best friend, which was Franz Rosenzweig. And he taught for Rosenzweig's Lehrhaus in Frankfurt. And there's a seminar that he gave there in 1922, which turned into this book. Not only did it turn into the book, but we have the seminar. Some of the things that he writes in the book were said to him by his students. In other words, there was some I-thou going on there, some co-creating. So, so that's why we're not talking about an existentialist, we're talking about a different way of thinking. And one that doesn't fit easily into Western thinking. It sailed right by family therapy, boop, and disappeared. It sailed by Gestalt and disappeared. It has yet to sail by CBT, but it probably will, and it'll get lost. It doesn't hold well. After the discovery of the mirror neurons, people started to say, "Oppa, I think that might be Buber." And so in 1916, the people who discovered the mirror neurons wrote a book together with, this is all Italians, with a psychoanalyst. And the first chapter of the book says, what we're learning is really in Buber's I and Thou. And that was in 2016. So it looks like, you know, in brain science, we're coming to understand something that may actually be able to be shown, but in the West, it was very difficult to get to. Why do I say in the West? Because Buber was deeply influenced by the East. And he was also deeply influenced by something that's not exactly Western, called Hasidus. Buber was the first person in the West who brought Hasidus to, you know, brought the Ostjuden, and these crazy Hasidim were jumping around and dancing. He brought them into Germany, to Berlin, and said, this is important. He wrote the stories of Rav Nachman, he wrote the stories of Baal Shem Tov, and and wrote, he created this masterpiece of the sayings of the different masters. He was an expert in Chassidut. And so some of relatedness comes from Chassidut. Those of you who know Chassidut can see it right here in Buber, although he won't be quoting it. Yeah.
I have trouble understanding how mirror neurons...
You're really having trouble. It's even getting to your neck, yeah? Yeah, okay.
Sitting right there.
Yeah.
I have trouble understanding how mirror neurons are the definition of I thou. Because to me, I thou means
right.
I'm a whole person, I'm differentiated. You are a separate whole person with your own thoughts and feelings, and we're going to come together and we're going to co-create from our two whole beings.
Right.
But mirror neurons are saying, what I see in you is really me. That sounds like enmeshment.
So this, you got the question? Why are we connecting mirror neurons with I and thou? Right? They seem to be verkehrt. And in the yeshivot you say, men stirbt nicht von der Kasha. That's, you're not die from a kasha, but actually men lebt von a kasha. I mean, that's what brings things alive. They're not the same thing. But the idea of the mirror neurons suggests a connectedness between people, which is more robust than what we thought. And now, when you bring the whole I to the whole you, is that just a mirror neuron? It's not just a mirror neuron, but maybe it's the mirror neurons that are the basis that make it possible. But you don't have to believe that, right? In other words, you could say, mirror neurons I get, that was a whole different story. That would be...
Maybe it's the embryo of the I-thou experience.
Yeah.
It has to start, just like you said, with babies, it has to start that way in order to create
right.
the I-thou.
So now we have an interesting metaphor, which we'll hold on to, which is that it's a gestational metaphor, that maybe that the mirror neuron is the embryo. And then things are supposed to grow, but without the mirror neuron, it maybe wouldn't grow.
Is the mirror neuron enmeshment?
No, the mirror neuron is not. Mirror neuron. Debbie thought that the mirror neuron is more connected to enmeshment. You see, the mirror neuron is part of human experience. It's not all of it, right? It's just a big surprise. The same way that when Buber said this is I thou, everybody said, "Whoa, this is a surprise. What are you talking about? There's an I and there's a him, but we don't know what you're talking about." So when the mirror neuron showed up, it was the same surprise. The people are more interconnected than they seem to be. The question of whether you take that towards regulation or towards intersubjectivity has to do with what you do with the embryo. Like, you grow the embryo and then what do you do with it? So those are things that whole people do, right? And anything that's in the brain is interesting but isn't the final answer. It's a basic answer. It tells us part of something we didn't know before, but it's not the whole story. Yeah?
The idea of mirror neurons is you're seeing in someone else an activity, and then you're repeating that in yourself, but you're not inherently connecting with the other person and experiencing their experience or their essence in any way.
Right.
You're simply reflecting. So it's not a co-creation, it's just a reflection.
Mirror neuron is not a co-creation. It's the embryo that makes that possible. It's one more aspect of it. But you can live without, Buber knew about I and thou when there weren't mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons could be I it, because you're just in kabel, you're whatever the word, you're receiving input and then you're putting forth output. You're not necessarily relating to another person.
Correct.
As a person.
Correct. In other words, the mirror neuron is not a relationship. The mirror neuron is something that happens. You put up your hand like this. If I feel like like it's my hand, then we may make us feel more interconnected, and I can use that towards co-creation, but I could use it to take it out of here.
A narcissistic person could still be mirroring others without any actual relational aspect to it.
Right, without reference to the President of the United States, but one of the seductive aspects of narcissism is a misuse of mirror neurons. The people who are seductive, and seductive in the sense of manipulation, they want to get you to do something, like pay for the hotel, or sex, or whatever it is that the manipulation is. So by using the mirror neurons, it's you can see that how does seduction work? the embryo of that is also the mirror neurons, right? Which means that we're also dangerous to each other. In other words, it's not just a party here. It's also a serious danger of connection between people, and it's probably why in the Western world it took an awful long time to recognize something that the East always knew about, because the Western world is based on the individual, and there's something to be said for that, but not everything, right? Buber's turnaround is something we're saying, well, the individual, I've been there, I've done that, there's something more. And that's where the second person comes from. But it's not one-to-one. In other words, I introduced you to the mirror neurons, first of all, because something that's leading brain science for 20 years you should know about, because you're using your brains and talking to other people with brains most of the time. But it's not the same. It's what you do with it. You know, there's an aspect of something, but not the whole thing. Buber's trying to do something that's much more complex, which involves choice. Choice is something that you choose. Yeah.
My brain has had a hard time understanding everything that's happening right now.
Good.
I'm not very theoretical and philosophical in my brain. Can you give a practical example in the therapy room where this I-thou dynamic, where I, as a therapist, could use it? And
see, if I were to say to you right now that this experience of having a hard time with thinking is something that bothers you not just here, isn't it?
Honestly, it doesn't come up that often.
Right. In other words, I'm trying to use, instead of talking about over there, in other words, in the therapy room, if you were talking about, I have trouble, with complex thoughts. Yeah. There are some people who have trouble with complex thoughts. Most of them become therapists instead of thinking about complex thoughts, because that's not what we do in the room. Freud happened to be, very good at complex thoughts. He wasn't a very good therapist. No, nobody thought that Freud was, everything that had to do with, put it this way, had Freud been a woman, he would have been a good therapist. But being a man in Vienna in 1900, he did not listen to people well. He forced himself to. But in order to learn, not to make people better. So if the example that I'm saying is that we talk about, you've had who else has told you that, and when did you think about it, and we'll be talking about it. But if I say to you directly, that would be turning to you, right? And that would happen in the room. That's why I'm, using the room.
If you're with the family, you turn two people together.
And say, could you try to talk about it? And they will fail, but we want to help them to understand that it's painful to fail, and that there may be hope that sometimes they were able to talk and something's getting in the way. So those would be examples. The truth is that once you see it, it's not theoretical. See, the problem is finding the words for it, but there's nothing theoretical about I-thou. The problem is to find the words. It took Buber a whole year to make up these words, and people have been trying to get rid of them for the last 100 years, but they haven't succeeded because there's no better way to talk about it. That's why I'm bringing this book. I don't know a better way to talk about it than this way, but it's a way of talking about something that's certainly richer than the words that we're talking about. So, but it's not theory. Buber's view of I and thou is that if you're looking for it out in the stratospheres, or even in depth, I don't know what, you're not seeing. It's right under your nose. It's right under your nose. It's what you do with your baby all the time, right? And there's a whole section that you may or may not read. It's a complicated section about how we start. The first primary word is thou. The thou comes before the I. Now, we said that the first subject of the intersubjective is the mother, right? So the thou comes before the I. The I is actually created out of some of the experiences with the thou. So people are always looking, and people require to feel human, or see, that's why he has the whole being only comes together in direct relating, in the I-thou. And that's what people want. People feel impoverished when they don't have the possibility of speaking second person to the people that they're close to. It impoverishes you, and you can't, in more modern terms, we say because you can't be involved in co-creation. And the only real creation that happens when you take all of yourself together is in relating, in direct relating. Now, that's not very theoretical. You know, and second person, third person is not so theoretical. Maybe I confused you a little bit because I brought in the mirror neurons and the brain and stuff like that. But Buber thought this was a simple book. He didn't have very good judgment, but he thought it was a simple book. Or that, put it this way, if it isn't a simple book, you're not getting it. It's a simple book. It's telling you something that it should be right under your nose. But the problem is that Western man has trouble appreciating it. In other words, when Freud sat behind his patient and came up with these interesting statements, he thought that he was doing it, right? That he was telling the client some things about himself that the client didn't know before. And then the client would have this, great experience of, now I know it. But that's not what was really going on in the room. That's all that Freud could see going on in the room. What was going on in the room is a relationship. So he's sitting behind the patient, in front of them, there's a relationship. And in the relationship, when he would say to the client, this is how I think it is for you, it turns out that was really a moment of I thou, right? And that's what allowed the co-creation. And so the interpretations we make are co-creations. We bring ourselves with what is brought up in ourselves from what the client is saying or doing with us, and we bring it back and it goes between us, right? So the question is whether you can see it or not. And you can't do family therapy without seeing it. Put it that way. If you don't see the I thou, it's very hard to do something other than Eitz that you give people advice, do this and do that. But in the room, if you're not allowing and giving privilege, that's the word that we use these days, giving privilege to the moments of a full being of two people. Now remember, two people, right? So then what about the third person? So that's when we were talking about attention before, right? In other words, when two people are co-creating, when they're in the I thou mode, people don't get jealous. People feel that they're in the presence of something that they desire too, that they would like to participate in. But you can't take it on somebody else because it has to be your I, right? Whereas if you're just, giving attention as some sort of commodity, then people get jealous. They say, I want some of that too, because there's no I, and it's the I it. When the I thou is there, people don't see. You'll see it in families. You say to a father, your son wants to speak to you now. He wants to speak to you in a way that he hasn't spoken before. Let's say I've been seeing the kid, for 6 weeks, and the kid says, well, I'm telling you this stuff, but I wish I could tell my father. You say, bango, that's what we're going to do. You want to do it at home, or you want me to help you? Oh, I can't do it at home. Let's see, the kid tells, bring him in. So bring the family in, and says, your son wants to speak to you. And the son begins to speak to the father in a new way. There can be a dozen other kids in the room. Everybody's going to be entranced by this moment because it's a moment that everybody desires. And being in the presence of that moment is not something that makes people jealous. It makes them hopeful. Now, is that always true? I don't know. Go and find out. It seems to be, that's how it seems to me. I'm pointing to the outside the window. That's, in my experience, that's when you get to those moments, people don't interrupt. People pay attention because there's something about it that says, I could be there too. I don't have to be there now and get it. There's no it. But I can be there too with that person or with some other person. So that's where the co-creation and the intersubjective come in. So far, so good? Was that helpful for you?
Very helpful.
Good, okay.
So I would just say that that's a very good example of where mirror neurons might actually be part of this process, because all the other people sitting in the room are now doing it themselves.
Oh, so now Debbie's bringing us back around. You like the mirror, you want to see the connection, right? So that's good. No, but you like philosophy, you're better at it than I am. So Debbie just made a new idea, which is that when the I thou is happening, other people's mirror neurons are mirroring the I thou, and that's good for them. Right. So you can play with these terms, but the important part of it is to pay attention to them. In other words, to see what's happening in the room and see where there's an opportunity for people to move on. Should we go on a little bit more? Yeah.
Maybe just another example. We had a group discussing group supervision this week. Someone was and seemed to connect in a profound way with the client in the video we were watching. You could see like a visceral response from the client. And the question he had asked him, I thought that was very personal. And then, like, right away he shifted into more like an advice-giving mode. And you could feel the energy change.
The therapist changed to advice giving, okay?
So we were feeling, I think maybe that's kind of this I thou going into I it. When you're as a therapist, when you lose the relational aspect and you kind of just talking or discussing an idea, and then you can feel the client just kind of, pull back within themselves and discussing, what the role of the therapist is, and if they're being being able to profoundly connect and move someone, rather than just dispensing advice or having some kind of abstract conversation.
Okay, so you heard the question. I hope that it's something that's familiar to all of you. Being in the I thou is not so easy. It's very intimate. It's very intimate. There's nothing more intimate. Not intimate in a sexual way, but intimate in a human interactional way. And so it's uncomfortable. And when we take upon ourselves to do therapy, we take upon ourselves an extraordinary intimacy with our clients, an intimacy which engages the whole of us, right? And then we say to ourselves, Gewalt, this is troublesome. This is a little threatening. This is too much. And the problem with knowing too much in therapy is that it gives us some sort of rationalization for leaving the direct relationship and starting to do advice, which is coming not from directly what's happening between us. See, if the therapist could stay with what's happening between us, then you could say, these are important moments in your life as well. You've allowed one of them to happen with me. Can they happen in your family? Did they not happen? You see, and then you're staying with the importance of it. But all of us will slip out of it. I just want to read you something on page 16. You see, some of you were reading one page ahead, and some of you were thinking 16 pages ahead. But where did this disappear?
Push the button. Just hit a button. Any button.
Hit a button, any button. That's supposed to be with that. But you said this is a computer that wants a thou, and that was an it. A button is just an it. We don't want to hit it. We want to say to the computer, this is a computer that's stuck in thou. Okay. There we go. Okay. So now, if you just turn to page 16 you have the pages numbered in the reader, right?
Yes.
So turn to page 16 at the very bottom, and you'll see something that Ephraim is getting to, which is, I think, for therapists, the most important statement in the book. And on page 16 of the pagination of the book, right? You see the numbers of the pages in the book. Page 16, the very last section. This is the exalted melancholy of our fate. Every thou in our world must become an it. Does not matter how exclusively present the thou was in the direct relation. As soon as the relation has been worked out or has been permeated with a means, that's what you're talking about, the thou becomes an object among objects, perhaps the chief, but still one of them, fixed in its size and its limits. Now, why is that an important statement? Because we're talking about moments of I and thou. We're not talking about something that's extended. People don't hold the relationship, the direct relationship, for very long. And you'll see this with your clients. We just learned from brain science that probably less than 4 seconds it ain't going to happen, right? But probably more than 30 seconds it's going to dissipate. In other words, these things come and go. That's why I showed you the dance, right? That the moments of I and thou are moments. And for those of you who know German, this statement is Das ist aber die erhabene Schwermut. Now, erhabene means exalted. Erhabene means to lift up. right? It means the sublime. And he's translated as melancholy, but schwer doesn't lift up. Schwer is down, right? Schwer is hard and heavy. So the idea of erhabene schwermut is a tension. Is a tension that human beings go into I and thou, and they also go out of I and thou. And Ephraim was pointing to one thing that happens, which is that you plutz in I and thou, partly because of the questions that you're asking for. Is this enmeshment? Am I being swallowed up? Is this a merger? Because at the time of the I and thou, you're not busy thinking of yourself as a separate person. You're not busy doing anything except being in the relationship. Is that a merger? No. It's a co-creation. But it can feel like a merger. It can feel like like something that would be enmeshed. Enmeshed means there aren't two people here. There's only one thing. That's not what Buber has in mind. There are two people here, but they're co-creating. But at the time, they're not feeling it. And so you may plutz and say, I have some advice for you, right? And then the I who has the advice is not the I of the second person, it's the I of the third person. That happens mostly to men. Men have the experience of being afraid of being submerged in something. Women often have the other experience, and that's why the erhabene schwermut, or the exalted melancholy, comes in. It's painful. It's painful to go out. Whether it have to go out or it happens when you go out, schwer. It's hard, right? It's unavoidable, but it hurts. And that exalted melancholy, sometimes what you'll do is you'll see people who refuse to go into the I thou. Sometimes they're therapists who say, well, you know, this, it's not that I'm afraid of what happens in it, but I can't bear the pain of it stopping. I can't bear the pain of moving out of it. It's painful, right? And so you'll see clients who avoid co-creation because they're afraid they're going to lose themselves in it, or who can't bear the pain of it stopping. Does that speak to you? The second one is nowhere in the psychiatric literature that I know. The only place that I know that it...
attachment.
What's that?
Avoidant attachment.
Avoidance would be more the assumption that you're avoiding because you're going to get swallowed up. You could.
No, I think, and from what I've read, and I did like a paper on it, was that avoidant, they're both actually desiring like attachment, both like anxious and avoidant.
Right.
Avoidant, they're too scared because they're scared that they have abandonment issues.
Okay, you could put it that way then. Okay, so
therefore they avoid it. They
there we
push
go.
you away before.
Everybody got that? An added footnote: avoidance attachment. Good. Okay. So all of attachment theory can be expressed in I and thou. It wouldn't hurt if it were, because this attachment doesn't allow exactly the definition of second person. It wouldn't hurt if it were there. It's a parallel development. So, so in avoidance attachment, or in the melancholy, the exalted melancholy, the pain of losing the I thou is a reason for some people to avoid going into the I thou. Right? That doesn't have to be seen as abandonment. It's just the pain of losing the I thou. In other words, that all second person communication turns into third person at some point. Right? Either because you finished, or because you're afraid of it, so you bust it up. Right? That's where he says that either because it's been worked out or permeated with a means. Right? One way or the other, it's painful to lose it. So that was, you see, you were thinking 16 pages ahead. There was a whole bunch of other questions. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Sometimes they're like.
Just help me to hear it though.
Okay, there are clients that have a hard time co-creating, and they have a hard time being in the I-thou relationship.
Right.
What do you do about that?
Keep regulating until they're ready. Right. In other words, the question was, what about clients who are afraid of the I thou? So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're not making them afraid of the I thou, right? But if we think that that's the difficulty, so that's where the differentiation is low, and the person's busy with regulating, and the I thou is frightening. Right? So in other words, what Buber's saying about the I thou is that you need it, you desperately need it, it's the core of your existence, but it's hard to allow yourself in it or hard to bear going out of it, so people would rather regulate. right? So when a client comes in would rather regulate, remember the graph, you can't stoop them into subjective. Now, is that true or not true? It's an interesting question. You see, there are those people who would say, well, regulate with them until they get to the point where they're safe enough, and then look for moments of I and thou. And there are some people who would say, just go right at it, right? In other words, the problem is with me, if I'm avoiding it, just go right at it. Buber used the term a wild swinging out into the other person, but he wasn't a therapist. And the answer is probably somewhere in there. In other words, there will be clients where you say, I think I'm getting sucked into this sort of avoidance, and so why don't I just allow myself this second person turning, and a surprise happens, because Buber's feeling is that nobody's ever very far from it. So Buber wouldn't necessarily agree with what I've been saying about the low differentiation and the regulation. He might say that's a bunch of psychobabble, and people can be elicited to come into it if you do it with them. My experience is mixed with that. I think sometimes it's the case and sometimes it's not. But you formulated the question that's important. The answer, I think, is sort of variable.
So my question was very similar to Rachel's.
Oh, what a surprise.
That a lot of, because you mentioned before that the I and thou can be very intimate.
Right.
And especially working with adolescents, you find that they often get very awkward and squirmy, and fidgety. They're not sure how to engage in that I and thou. So what do you do?
Probably go back to regulating. In other words, when you're trying to create second-person communication, but still we're trying to talk to another person, and so it may not be familiar to them, it may be frightening, it may be that they've been seduced too many times and it looks exactly like that, and so they need to have some space to feel safe. The I thou does not feel safe. Co-creation is not a safe place. Safety is a regulation, right? You're looking for trouble when you're going to I thou. You're looking for salvation, but you're looking for trouble. In other words, you're looking to make something less well-regulated and problematic and perhaps scary. So you have to see it from your point of view and from the client's point of view. You don't want to become a minefield for the client. You want to take a walk where at some point the client can turn to you. We already answered your question?
No, I'm just wondering.
Wondering is, that's good.
When you say regulate,
just talk a little louder.
When you say regulate,
right?
You mean just go back into reflecting, chatting? Like, what do you mean? That's what I find. Like what they're saying also. Like, the way I see it, like put it into terms that are much more like is a person built for himself protection, to protect himself from pain, from difficult feelings. And from what I understand, our goal in therapy to make the I more whole is to bring the person more in touch with themselves, so they're not afraid of feelings, so they're not reacting to something that they're not even conscious that they're reacting to.
That they what?
That they're reacting to. They're not even conscious of it.
Right.
That's where also the whole thing with the brain, I think, comes into action. Certain things trigger us, certain things, we react to certain things that happen to us and we don't realize it. So when you try to bring something from when the person is resisting, you kind of have to respect their, that it's too much and it's, the protection is, you just feel like there is a resistance, you cannot go there.
Right.
So then what happens to me then is that I feel like, so what am I doing here?
Good. Okay.
Like I'm just being like a friend. Like what do you do
instead of? Not even extend the question a little bit?
Does somebody repeat it? Because we have we have visitors in the camera, so let's just repeat it and then you'll extend it. The question is, somebody's telling stories, and I'm listening to the stories, but what is that? What's my role? Yeah.
Right, and even more so, if let's say you're trying to get the co-creation, to bring up that painful idea or whatever, but not even that there's resistance, but there's managed a blockage. That person can't even have put in such an unconscious blockage that he or she can't even connect to the fact that there is a connection.
Right. Okay. So that you ramped it up. This is now it's getting real, right? There's a mamish blockage. That's
no,
you apparently have experienced, right?
In my mind,
Right.
that, like,
In other words, people say, leave me alone, right? I didn't come here for you to make trouble for me. I came here for you, for example, to regulate me. I came here because I have too much anxiety and now you're making me anxious. Knock it off, right? That's not what I came for. And so, should we be looking for the I thou at that moment? Probably not. Because you want to see, the best way that this works is when our listening allows our client to turn to us. In other words, a person is experiencing a certain kind of listening and then can turn to us and say, did you understand what I said? And then we can say, I'm trying to imagine what that was like for you. Tell me more. You think that I've got some of it, but you want me to get more. And so we're relating. That's when it works best, right? What I've been doing, which is sort of like, I don't know what I'm doing, is making it possible for the client to feel better regulated, safer, understood, right? Not attacked. If you think about our clients, they used to, when they're telling what's going on, they used to being attacked. They used to being ignored. They used to being erased or belittled, right? So somebody is taking them very seriously. Now, if that's enough, then you keep doing that, and you sort of say to yourself, this is going to go somewhere, but let's leave it to his space. In other words, the I thou doesn't have to come from me. Have you had moments where a client turns to you and wants to address you directly? Say, can you tolerate what I just said? I just said the most awful thing about my brother, but I don't see that you're plutzing. How is it that you're not plutzing? So they're talking to me, right? So that's different than my saying, listen, now get into what it is about your brother that you want to, rip his kishkas out, right? That's going to scare the daylights out of your client. So you don't do that. You wait until they say, when I look at your face, I don't see what I'm expecting to see, which is, some sort of horror. That's where the mirror neurons working, right? That they're expecting to see this and then, nobody's plutzing. So then they turn to us and say, what's on your face? Tell me what it is that's happening between us. And that's where the relationship, as a real relationship, as a second person relationship, you go in it, through it, and out of it. It won't be very long, right? It's not like you'll say, listen, this is going to take us 45 minutes. I'll tell you everything that I felt. That's not how it works. You go into it, but something happens. Now, how do you know that something happened? Because something happened to me. Now, what is that? What would have happened to me? And that's where this idea of the whole being is central. In other words, something happened to me in the sense that a lot of more of me than I'm used to got involved in this, and some parts that I'm not used to, right? Because I hadn't recalled that I wanted to kill my brother until I had this discussion, and now I'm getting to that part, and something's happening in me as well, right? So then the client says, well, that wasn't very useful, and if you say, well, maybe it was frightening, but something happened to me, so perhaps something happened to you too in that quiet moment. That's something that you can say to clients. So is this getting us, you see why we're doing this? There's a little bit more that we're going to do at the next session. The more that you can read of it, the better the next session will be. We'll spend 1 more hour on it, and then you can just imagine what the exercise is going to be, or perhaps not, but stay in there. Is there any more questions? Yeah, okay, yeah. We have time.
It feels like it's, again, going back to the start, it feels like it's focusing on the dynamic, what's going on between them.
Right. So there's an important word in I and thou, which is the German word Gegenwart. Anybody know I think it's the same in Yiddish. Gegenwart means a couple of different things. It means the present time. It means presence. And when it means not an object. In Buber, the third person in Western philosophy, the object in German is the Gegenstand. Gegenstand is something that's just standing there against me. Gegen is against, right? And the Gegenwart is somebody waiting for me. In other words, there's time. But what time? The present. I now is only about the present, right? And a lot of what comes into many kinds of therapy that say, well, you know, what do we need to hear about the past? Let's stay with the here and now. That comes out of this. Is that all there is to therapy? No. Well, family systems, you see, that's an interesting question. The question is, but if this present is so important, so why do we talk about all the past? If you recall what Bowen said about the person comes in with 60 other people in 60 years, right? In other words, it's all there, it's still happening. So the reason to understand the past is to be able to understand what's happening now, because it's repeating things from the past. There's no particular value in and of itself of hearing all these Bobemaises, right? The point of it is to understand the triangles, the relationships, and the way the relationships are still being burdened by relationships from other places, so that we can see what's happening now. But the moments of co-creation don't happen in the past, right? They happen in the present. And if you want to extend your question a little more, so what do you mean? Freud was only talking about the past. Freud said to his to Dora, but this is what you wanted to do when you were 2 years old. And she said, I'm cured. So he was talking about the past, right? And the answer is no. He was telling her this in the present. An I-thou connection was made, a direct experience of an older man being able to tell her something about something that she's been hiding from herself, and for her to allow herself to understand in this relationship that it's happening differently. That was the vehicle of change, and not just the content about the past. Now, can you prove that? No, but you can say it. So I just said it. In other words, you can never not be in the present, right? You can be talking about the past, but you're always talking about the past, thinking about how it's happening in the present. And transference is always in the presence, right? Transference is always something that happened in the past that's now happening in the present. So therapy takes place in the here and now, and the idea of the I, thou, and the I, it, you see, the information about the past is always it. It's always third person. But it helps us to find a way to make a moment where there's a second person as well. So do the best you can to work yourself through. The book has 3 parts. The first part is about the basic words themselves. The second part is about human society. The third part is about God. And most people read the first part. The first part is the part that we really need most. You'll find some of it harder going, some of it easier. If it seems hard, think simple. He's not telling you things that, he's a poet, so he's doing it in a poetic way, but he's not telling you things that aren't under your nose. There's nothing in this book that you have to know any concept to be able to understand. It's not a conceptual book. If it were, and I'll tell you one last thing. I was involved with this book, as you can tell, for quite a while, and I've been teaching it for quite a while. And then I was giving a conference or something, and one of my teachers, a guy named Zalman Schachter, who was from before he wasn't so from, but he was a great genius in Talmud Chacham. So he had noticed he was able to give me a conference at the same place. He Googled himself, and he saw that there was a conference on Zalman Schachter. So he looked and saw what else. He said, I'm giving a conference on Buber. So he calls me up. He's about 89 at the time. And he said, I see you're giving a talk on Buber. I said, yeah. He said, it's impossible. I said, no. He said, but Buber isn't about, it's not a book. You see, at his 10th Yortzeit in 1975, the conference, we did labs. We practiced it. It's a practice. So I said to Zalman, who had this way of smiling over the phone, I said, I think you're telling me that the book is not a book, it's a lab. He said, there's certain Eastern Europe, Middle Europeans who are able to do this on the phone, and you could. So it's a lab. It's not a book. It's not a standard book. It's something that either speaks to you, or it's in it. So let it speak to you as much as you can with this Alter Sachen that's almost 100 years old, and we'll try to pick it up next time. Thank you.